Okay, so today's daf is Masekhet Eruvin Daf Samech, and we are going to start on Nun Tet Amud Bet towards the bottom, where it says Amar Rav Ada. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom. It says Amar Rav Ada, Amar Rav. Rav Ada said that Rav said, Sulam Torat Petach Alav, V'Torat Nechita Alav. That a ladder can sometimes function halachically as a doorway, and sometimes can function legally as a wall. So Torat Mechitza Alav Kid Amaran. We've already talked about ways in which it can function as a kind of mechitza, as a kind of a partition, which was in the previous sugya, the previous piece of Gemara talked about the function as a partition. However, Torat Petach Alav, now we're talking about the status as a doorway, Bisulam Sheben Shetei Chatzerot, Ratzu Echad Me'arev, Ratzu Shenai Me'arevin. That basically, let's say you have two Chatzerot, you have two courtyards that adjoin one another. They have a choice. In other words, if there's no entrance between two courtyards, they can't make one Eruv together. They're two separate entities. But if they have a doorway between the two of them, they can. Now, what if there's a ladder between the two of them? So if there's a ladder that gives them the option, Ratzu Me'arevin, they can do it together. So Ratzu Echad Me'arev, Ratzu Shenai Me'arevin. If they want to, they can combine together. If they want to, they can stay separately. But the point is that the ladder serves as a petach. It's considered to be a doorway if they want to use it to combine their identities. Umi Amar Rav Nachman Hachi, and did Rav Nachman really say this? Okay. Because really I skipped the part from before where it was really Rav Nachman introduced this. It was Rav Nachman speaking to the people before and saying this is what Rav Ada said in the name of Rav. So did Rav Nachman really endorse this statement of Rav Ada? V'amar Rav Nachman said, Amar Shmuel in the name of Shmuel, Anshe Chatzer v'Anshe Mirpeset, if you have people who live in a chatzer, in a courtyard, or they live in a mirpeset, they live in an elevated kind of they call it a gallery. In other words, they live in an elevated area that's above the actual ground of the chatzer, like in a second floor apartment sort of situation, right? But there's a way to get from the second floor, obviously, to the courtyard, but it's elevated. Okay, Shishachu velo ervu. They forgot to join with the rest of the courtyard. So these people who live in the elevated area forgot to join together with the people in the chatzer. So there's a problem for everybody, because if any individuals who are part of that community don't participate in the eruv, nobody can carry in the chatzer now. Nobody can carry in the courtyard. So what do we do? So it says, Im yesh lefnehem daka arba'a ina oseret. If there is a small partition of 4 tefachim, okay, in height, so ina oseret, it does not, they don't cause the chatzer, they don't interfere with the courtyard's eruv. However, if not, v'imlav oseret, if they don't have any division between them, then they are going to prohibit everybody in the chatzer. So Rashi says, what is daka mean? Petach katan, a small doorway, gova arba'a, that has a 4 tefachim height. In other words, it has some kind of an opening, some kind of a way to get in and out. And basically, what would this way be? It would be a ladder, because how do you get from this elevated area to the floor of the chatzer? You get through a ladder. And the point is that if you have some kind of an entrance leading from the gallery to the chatzer, and it's through a ladder, so then that's going to combine the people living in the gallery with the people in the chatzer, because they have a direct entry. So what do you see from that? You see that the sulam, you see that this sort of here, well, I'll show you what it looks like. Here it is. It's illustration number 222. So you can see that there's a little area here that goes there's a little ladder that goes down to a little spot in the chatzer. It goes down to a little spot in the courtyard. Now, if it has that kind of thing, it has that sort of a special partition. In other words, the point is that if it has a special entrance, okay. So, but that entrance is blocked off with the small partition. So then the fact that the ladder is there doesn't make it problematic. But if there's no partition, in other words, if the ladder goes directly from the elevated dwellings into the courtyard, that's considered a doorway. Okay, so the ladder itself is considered a doorway. If there's nothing blocking the foot of the ladder from the courtyard, if there's something blocking the foot of the ladder from the courtyard, so that shows that it's cordoned off. If it's a 4 tefach high sort of thing. But if there's nothing, in other words, you go down the ladder and you're in the courtyard and there's nothing blocking you, then you're part of the courtyard. That's just your way of getting in and out, is with the ladder. So what do you see? That the ladder is definitely considered a doorway. So how can Rav Nachman say that it's sometimes considered a doorway and sometimes not? It's not optional. It sounds like it's automatically a doorway. So the Gemara says, no. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about where this so-called elevated area is lower than 10 tefachim. It's not full 10 tefachim off the ground. And therefore, since it's not full 10 tefachim off the ground, it's really considered part of the ground. Then the Gemara says, wait a second. If you're telling me that this mirpeset is not 10 tefachim tall, in other words, if this supposed elevated area is not 10 tefachim high, so kika avid daka mayave. So what benefit is there in having the partition? The partition shouldn't help either. The partition is just a little piece of, just a little thing that's 4 tefachim. It doesn't do anything. It's not a real wall. So why should it be that this little sort of a partition is going to make a difference? If you're within 10 tefachim of the ground, then this elevated area is not an elevated area at all. This elevated area is really considered flush with the ground, and the fact that you put a little 4 tefach partition there should not create any division between the this mirpeset and the floor. So that's the case over here. You see. You could see the drawing here in 223. So it's less than 10 tefachim. It has a little porch. It's more like a porch than a gallery, and it has a little thing called a daka, a little fence there. But that little fence, how does that change this from being considered part of the courtyard? It's within 10 tefachim of the courtyard. So what difference does it make? So the Gemara says, "B'migofefet ad 10 amot." We're talking about a case where it is flanked on either side with a space of up to but not including 10 amot. Because since you have a fence at all, in other words, what you have here, basically they don't show this in the picture so clearly. Oh, actually they kind of do. I guess they do. What they're showing is that this is flanked. In other words, they're trying to show in the picture here that this is a wall. And then you have this then you have the ladder here, and an additional small kind of partition. So in the end, you only have a small space. So most of the area, in other words, on the left side, let's say there's a fence separating this porch from the courtyard, and on the right side, there's also a small fence where the ladder goes down. There's also a small fence separating the bottom of the ladder from the courtyard, and there's only a little space in between. So because of that's why it's considered optional. We can look at that as part of the courtyard, or we can look at that as distinct, depending on what the people want to do. So they say, since they put that daka there, they put that, in other words, they could have just had most of the porch completely sealed off, and then an opening on the right side where the ladder comes down. But since they sealed off the bottom of the ladder as well with a small partition, they're showing we don't want to be part of the courtyard. They're showing we're independent of the courtyard, and even to get from us to the courtyard, you have to go through this other little fence. So that's why it's considered distinct. But normally, what would it? We can't conclude in a normal case, let's say, where the gallery were actually more than 10 tefachim off the ground, we can't conclude whether a ladder unites the gallery with the courtyard or not. Because we're talking about a complicated case where this elevated area was actually almost totally sealed off from the courtyard, except for a small space, and the small space had a ladder, and that was sealed off. So because there's a lot of sealing going on, we don't know whether a ladder leading, let's say, from an elevated gallery that's actually elevated would be considered connected to the courtyard below or not. We can't conclude it. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, so therefore basically we can uphold what Rav Nachman said before, that it depends. In other words, that it's not clear, that sometimes you can have a situation where you have in other words, it's optional. You can, when you have a ladder between two chatzerot, they can decide whether they want to unite or not, or whether they want to be separate. Because the case here, where we're talking about where it's dependent on putting a small fence, is where it's almost totally sealed off anyway. Where normally it would be within 10 tefachim of the ground. But it's mostly sealed off, except for the ladder. And the ladder itself is sealed off. So that's why it is a more complicated case than our case. So now we say, so Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel says, Kotel sheritzafa basulamot. Let's say a wall was completely lined with ladders. Afilu biyeter me'eser torat mechitza alav. Even if you had more than 10 amot covered completely with ladders, so you could say, well, those ladders kind of eliminate the meaning of the wall, because you climb right over the wall with the ladder. So how is that a wall? So it says it doesn't matter. It doesn't interrupt the wall. It's still considered to be a partition. In other words, we don't say that because you have ladders going across that are 10 amot, and normally if you had a 10 amah hole through the wall, that would break the wall. We don't say that these sulamot, that these ladders are going to be considered a break in the wall. Rav Bruna asked an objection to Rav Yehuda when they were sitting at the wine press of the house of Rav Chanina. Mi amar Shmuel trat nachitza alav. Did Shmuel really say that if you line up ladders, it's considered to still be a wall? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, but Rav Nachman said that Shmuel said, Anshe mirpeset v'anshe chatzir sheshachuv lo erev im lo yesh lefanei daka arba'a ena oseret v'im lav oseret. Didn't Rav Nachman say that Shmuel said that if you have an elevated area, and the elevated area has a ladder that goes down into the courtyard, if you block the foot of the ladder with a 4 tefach sort of small partition, then the elevated area is separate from the courtyard. And if it doesn't have a small partition, then it's connected to the courtyard, implying that what? That a ladder would normally be considered not a wall, but actually a doorway. A ladder is actually considered a doorway. So this is the same thing we quoted before. So what are we talking about here? We must be talking about a case where the elevated area is within 10 tefachim of the ground. In other words, they're just going through the same exact discussion that we did before. If it's totally elevated, you're right. But we're talking about a case where this elevated area is actually within 10 tefachim of the ground, and that's why the ladder would make it considered part of the courtyard. But if it were really, really high, then the ladder wouldn't be considered an opening. But if the elevated area is actually not elevated, it's within 10 tefachim of the ground. So how is it going to help me if I have a ladder going right to the courtyard? It's just like having a step down right into the courtyard. So why should putting a little 4 tefach, a little small partition at the foot of the ladder, why should that help me? Okay, if I'm going to put it so close, how's that going to help me? So the answer is that the same answer that we gave before, that we're talking about where it's flanked. In other words, this area, this elevated area, yes, it's very close to the floor of the courtyard. So you might think it should be considered identical with the courtyard. But the only thing is that it's walled off for the most part, except for the area that has the ladder. Okay, so that case is where it's really dependent. If we could say that because it's mostly cordoned off to begin with, it's really separate. But the ladder kind of makes it open. So what do we say? So the answer is that if you block off the ladder as well, we say the whole thing is blocked off. If you leave the ladder open, since it's so close to the ground already, okay, it's within 10 tefachim, we say that ladder is considered like stepping right into the courtyard. But if you actually had a gallery that was elevated and you had ladder coming down from it, there it's not so clear that we would consider that a doorway so simply, because it's still very far from the floor of the courtyard. And therefore they were saying that that's why even if you line up ladders along a wall, it's not considered to remove the wall. It's still considered to be a partition. It's not considered to remove the wall, even though you could climb over the ladders and hop the wall. So now the Gemara says, Hanhu b'nei Kakonai, Rav Yosef, the people of Kakonai came to Rav Yosef. Amrule, they said, Havlan Gavra, send us somebody. Dili Arav Lan Matin, we want someone to come and make an eruv for our city. Amar le Abaye, so Rav Yosef said to his student Abaye, Zil Arev lo, go make them an eruv. And don't do anything controversial. Don't do anything that they're going to complain about in the Beit Midrash. Don't try to be a maverick. Just do something that works. Now, what kind of eruv do they want? They mean fix our city so that we're allowed to, because we learned that there are certain rules about making an eruv chatzerot or a shituf. That even if you have an enclosed city, you can't necessarily carry in that city. If there's a lot of people living there, you need an eruv chatzerot. Sometimes you need a shituf. And if there are a lot of people in the city, if it's what's called ir shel rabim, that it's a major metropolis, even that is not enough. You have to cordon off part of the city. You have to do something additional to fix it. So they asked Abaye to come and do whatever repairs needed to be done to the city or the situation that they'd be able to make an eruv. So he went there. So Abaye saw that there were certain houses that were open to the river. Their opening was to the river. They weren't facing the rest of the courtyard. They weren't facing the rest of the city. They were facing out towards the river. So and he saw that Amar, and he said, Hanei leheve shi'ur lemata. These will be the houses of the city that will not be included in the eruv, because we said that in order to take a large metropolis and have an eruv, you have to cut off part of the city that's not included. You have to seal it off. So he said, since these houses open in the opposite direction, they open towards the river, we're just going to say that these houses are the ones that are not part of the eruv. That's all. They don't have an opening that leads into the city anyway. They were like townhomes that were lined up, and they had the opening going straight out. So they weren't really directly open to the courtyard anyway. So then he said, Hadar Amar, then he went back and said, no, in ma'arvinet kulatanan, miklal ibai le'iruvei, matze me'arvei. No, we can't use these houses, he said. You know why? Because it says that you have to do something deliberate to exclude certain sections of the city. But these houses couldn't be included anyway, because they don't have any opening that they share with the common area. So since they don't have any opening that they share with the common area, we couldn't include them anyway. So who are we fooling here? These are not really part of the city to begin with. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make windows in the back of these houses. And if I make windows in the back of these houses, then there's access between these houses and the courtyard. If there's access between these houses and the courtyard, now they could be included and we'll exclude them. How about that? Because if they wanted to join, they could, but we're not going to let them, and we're really making a statement by excluding them. But Hadar Amar, then he said, Lo ba'i, actually they don't need to. They don't need it. Why? He said, you know what? We have a precedent for this kind of situation, that even though there's a section of the city that couldn't be combined with the other sections, it can still be considered excluded from the eruv. Why? Because Rabba bar Avua went to Mechoza, and there were multiple neighborhoods in Mechoza, and they were separated by very deep, wide ditches. Each ditch was like 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide, filled with food, with animal fodder actually. So there were the individual neighborhoods within the city were separated one from the other. They were not allowed to be combined in an eruv with one another, because they had these ditches separating them that were not traversable. You couldn't go over them. So what was the point? Even though the individual neighborhoods could never have combined together, he still said that excluding one, in other words, let's say there were five neighborhoods, let's say. So each one can have an eruv because they're excluding the other ones. Even though the other ones really couldn't have made an eruv with them because they're physically separated by these ditches, but the fact that they're open to one another, even though practically they couldn't make an eruv with one another, didn't matter. Okay? So here too, these houses that their backs face to the common area, even though there's no way they could actually be included in an eruv with the rest of the people in the common area, we can still say we're excluding them. So then he said, but then he said, Hadar Amar, then he went back and said, no, lo dameh. It's not true, because Hatam ibai la'arovei derech gagot, v'anei lo ma'arovei, ilkach navdan kaveh. So he said, no, because in the case of Abba bar Avua, it was different, because even though they had ditches in between them, the roofs of the houses actually, and the balconies, you could go from one to the other, between these neighborhoods. So really there was access from one to the other. And so excluding sections of that city really made a difference, because you actually could have had access from one to the other. But here, there's no access. These houses that are facing the river, there's no access from them to the rest of the city.
Even with the windows?
Right. No. That's why he said, therefore we have to put windows in to make access. We have to make access and then exclude them. That's the only way we can do it. Hadar Amar, then he said, no, kaveh nami lo ba'e, we don't need any. Dahud be'tivna dahave le'lemar bar popidata bepumbedita ve'shaveh shi'or lepumbedita, because there were certain storehouses of straw that belonged to Mar bar Pupidata in Pumbedita, and they left them as the area of the city to be excluded, because we have to exclude some part of the area to show that there's a limit on the Eruv. So they excluded these storehouses even though they were totally sealed off. There was no access to them. There was no way to get in and out of them. They were closed, and yet they used them as a leftover. So he says, so too, true. So I guess that they must have been somehow had some dwelling in them for the people who worked there or something like that. So they even though there was no access between them and the rest of the city, they used that as what was left over, and therefore we see so too here. Even though these houses that face the river don't have any windows or any physical way of accessing the common area, we can leave them as our excluded section. And therefore he didn't make windows. And Hainu de Amar Limar Chazei de la Mitzavachat ala Babe Midrasha. He said, look at all the difficulties I'm having here, going back and forth, trying to figure out what I need to do. He said, this must be why my master Rabbi Yosef said, don't do anything that they're going to scream about in the Beit Midrash. Because he kept going back and forth trying to figure out what he had to do. And obviously, had he brought his original solution to the Beit Midrash, they would have yelled at him. Then he would have retracted, they would have yelled at that. So he went through the whole dialogue in his head. Instead of having this dialogue in the Beit Midrash with the other Rabbanim who would have raised these objections, he raised them to himself and answered them and solved the problem that he didn't need to do anything. He could leave those houses that had just a door, the doors face away from the city, as the excluded portion for the Eruv. So we said that you have to exclude something like the city of Chadasha, which had 50 people living in it. As we said in the Mishnah, you have to leave a section of the large metropolis that is not included in the Eruv. Tanya, it says in the Braita, Rav Yehuda says, Ir Achat Hayita Yehuda v'Chadasha Shema. There was a city in Yehuda, and it was called Chadasha. Vayuba Nunat Diurim. It had 50 Diurim. It had 50 dwellers. Anashim v'nashim b'taf, men, women, and children. Uva hayu misharim chachamim. Vehi hayita shiur. And this was what was left over out of the larger area to allow them to make an eruv. Because since you're making an eruv in a place which is considered such a public major area, we need to at least cordon off part of it that's not included in the Eruv to remind people that you can't carry from a public domain to a private domain and vice versa. Otherwise they'll say, what, we're carrying in this public domain? Nope, it's not a public domain because you have to section off part of it to allow us to carry. You can't just carry anywhere.
Is 50 people the city? The big metropolis?
50 people was the section that they excluded. That was the section they excluded. So that's what they made as their measurement, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Ibailu, they asked the following question, what about the city of Chadasha itself? So Chadasha, just like Chadasha was considered excluded from the Eruv of the large city, and it was in other words, it was the part excluded from its larger sister city or area, so too the larger area that was excluded from it allowed it to be a place where they could carry. But so the answer is, so the question is, so then what's the question? What about a city of 50 people in the situation like Chadasha? We understand that in Chadasha itself, there was a symbiotic relationship. Chadasha was excluded from the larger area. The larger area was excluded from Chadasha. So each one could have its own Eruv. But what about just a freestanding city of the same size as Chadasha? Mahu, what do we have to do? Since it itself is the measurement of what needs to be left over, how can you leave over within it? By definition, it's too small to leave over within itself. It's like Zeno's paradox, You can't walk because in order to walk a mile, you have to walk half a mile. And if you want to walk half a mile, you have to walk a quarter of a mile. And you can subdivide only so much. So what if you have to subdivide the subdivision? So what do you do now? So the answer is, the Gemara says, Rav Huna Rav Yehuda Chad Amar Bayashiur V'Chad Amar Lo Bayashiur. There's a machloket. Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda argue. One says it needs its own piece to be left over. One says it doesn't, and the halacha follows that it doesn't. But the big question here is that according to Rashi, the definition of a major city that requires a remnant to be left over is a city that has 600,000 people in it. And obviously, if the city only has 50 people in it, it doesn't have 600,000. So it fits very well with most of the commentaries that say that an Ir Shel Rabim, a large city that requires a piece to be left over, is not talking about a city that has 600,000 people going in it every day, but it's talking about a city that is owned by the Rabim. That is not, it's not private property. Let's say like the difference between a public area that's owned by the city, municipally owned, versus let's say a private development, where you live in a townhome development and individuals are part of own it together. Either a group of individuals or one individual owns the home, like you have a landlord that owns the whole property. Okay, here we're talking about an Ir Shel Rabim that it's communal. It's a communally owned thing. It's open to it's public. So that's the distinction, that a public area requires a remnant to be left over. A privately owned or partnership owned area doesn't require. Okay? Then you can say, okay, Chadasha, even though it had only 50 people, maybe it also requires a section to be left over because it's publicly owned. Or you could say, but according to Rashi, you have to have 600,000 people to require a remnant to be left over. So how does that work? It's a big problem. So the Farshim try to explain it. Now also nowadays, the question comes up. So then, according to the other Rishonim, none of our Eruvin should be good. Because we don't leave over a part that could be included in the Eruv that's not included in the Eruv. So the Mishnah Berurah has to come along and say, well, we're relying on Rashi who says that if they're not 600,000 people, so then we don't need to leave over a part of the city.
How do you define partnership?
Meaning individuals who own it. Like I wouldn't say that you and I, everyone at this table, we all own part of that street.
Let's say a condominium.
Right. So individuals own it. That's still a group, but it's not public. Public means it belongs to the city, it belongs to the community. There's still a partnership is considered, I own with you, even if it's 100 of us, we all own a share, excluding other people, not just anybody. Whereas the street there, nobody can come and be like, excuse me, you don't live in Rockville, you live in Virginia, you can't come on my street because I own part of this street and I'm not going to let you do it. Because it's owned by public. All right, so that's an issue, though. That's a big issue about how does Rashi explain this issue of the Chadasha? Now, Rabbi Shimon said, and so some try to say, well, maybe Chadasha was a city that was once full of 600,000 people, and then it became smaller. So Rashi will say that because it was once 600,000 people and it became smaller, the original din is still going to apply. But still, then he's going to have a problem with our cities today, possibly. Because even if, because population shifts all the time. So it's a big problem. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Omer Gimel Chatzerot B'Chulei. So Rabbi Shimon says you don't need to leave over an area of 50 dwellers. Even 3 Chatzerot, each of which has 2 houses, is enough. Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria says that Rav says halachak Rabbi Shimon, Bel halachak false Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says afilu bayit achad v'chatzer achat, that even if you had one house and one courtyard, it's enough. You don't need 2 or 3. You don't need 3 chatzerot with 2 houses each, like Rabbi Shimon says. You can have 1 chatzer with 1 house. Chatzer achat al kadatach. 1 chatzer, seriously. Ella ema bayit echad b'chatzer achat. What he meant was, even if 1 house in 1 courtyard is left out of the eruv, that's enough to allow the entire place to function. Okay? Now, obviously, if there's 1 house in the chatzer that's excluded, he's going to ruin his whole chatzer. So it could mean that everything else was vacated. In other words, you have a chatzer that everyone else moved out. There's only 1 guy living in there. So in the end, only 1 guy is excluded from the total eruv of the metropolis, and it's still good enough according to Rabbi Yitzchak. So the Gemara says, Amar Lei said to him, Amar Lei Abayi Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi said to Rabbi Yosef, Had Rabbi Yitzchak Gemara Usvara. What Rabbi Yitzchak said, was that a Gemara? Was that a tradition he had? Or did he come up with that himself? Because where did he get it? It's not mentioned in the Mishnah anywhere that only 1 house could be excluded. Amar Lei said to him, Mai nafkalan mina, what do you care? Rabbi Yosef said to Abaye, who cares? He said it. He said it. Amar Lei Gemara Gemor Zamor Tatehe. This is a famous line that Abaye says to Rav Yosef in several places in the Shas, in Masekhet Shabbat, Masekhet Betzah. He says, we're learning Torah. Is it just a song? In other words, I can't ask you a question. You're just telling me to accept it on authority. It's not just a song, meaning we don't just recite halachot. We have to understand, where is it coming from? Is it, what's the source? I'm asking you, what's the source? He didn't give him an answer. The new Mishnah says, Mishaya b'mizrach v'amar livno arev li b'ma'arav v'ma'arav v'amar livno arev li b'mizrach. If a person was standing in the east and he told his son, place my eruv in the west, or vice versa, he was standing in the west and he told his son to place the eruv in the east. Im yeshem eno leveto al payim amal eruvo yoter mikan mutal leveto v'asur le'eruvo le'eruvo al payim amal leveto yoter mikan asur leveto umutal le'eruvo. If in between himself and his home is 2,000 amot. In other words, if the eruv is more than 2,000 amot away from where he's standing, then the eruv is invalid, and his house still determines his tichum. But if he's further away from his house is more than 2,000 amot away from him right now, where he's standing at the beginning of Shabbat, but the eruv is within 2,000 amot of him, then he goes with the eruv, determines his place for Shabbat. We'll see why this is significant in a second. If a person places the eruv in the ibura shel ir, in the 70 and 2/3 amah, that's outside of the city. Remember, the city has a limit, and then 70 and 2/3 amah outside of the city is still considered the outskirts of the city. And let's say there's a house there, there's a structure there that makes it considered part of the outskirts of the city. And he placed his eruv in there, it's nothing. Why? Because that outskirt would be considered part of the city anyway. And the tichum is only measured once you leave the city. And since there's even one residence in that outskirt, it's an extension of the city. Once he puts it outside of the tichum, and we don't mean the tichum here outside of the area that he can walk. What it means is once he puts it outside of the outskirts of the city. Let's say you have a city and here's the outskirt, so he puts the eruv right here, a step outside of the outskirts. So then, as we turn to Amud Bet Masha, Niskar hu mafsid, whatever he gains, he loses. In other words, let's say he put his eruv to the west, even one amah out. So the one amah that he gains, that he can now walk 2,001 amot this way, he loses to the east. He can only walk now 1,999 amot that way, right? Because he placed his position, he established his position to the left, to the west, as opposed to the east. So the Gemara says, so when we read the Mishnah, it's strange, because it says, he is to the east, and he tells his son to put the eruv to the west. Then it says, he is to the west, and he tells his son to put the eruv to the east. But the problem is like this. It says, if he's further from his house than he is from the eruv, then he goes by the eruv. If he's further from his eruv than he is from the house, he goes by his house, right? But the problem is like this, that if we understand. In other words, he's standing to the west. He tells his son, place the eruv to the east. Okay? If the eruv is more than 2,000 amot away, but his house is within 2,000 amot, we can understand that. We can understand how we can reach his house before he reaches the eruv, because he's standing all the way over here. His house is here, and he told his son, go to the east and place the eruv. So the eruv is here. So we understand he was traveling in the wilderness or whatever. He can reach his house because it's within 2,000 amot of where he's standing, but he can't reach his eruv. But how could the opposite be true? Because if the eruv is further east from him than his house, so how could it possibly be that he can reach his eruv but he can't reach his house? It doesn't make any sense. How is there ever a situation where he can reach his eruv but not his house? If the eruv is by definition more eastward than his house. Why are you assuming we're talking about to the east of his house and to the west of his house here? What we're talking about here is that we're not talking about his location relative to his house. When we said, place the eruv to the east or the west, we're talking about relative to his son, wherever his son is standing. We don't know where the guy is standing. So he says to his son, go to the east of where you are and place the eruv. Go to the west of where you are and place the eruv. Okay? So we don't know where the guy is originally standing. We just know that his son is going to go to the east or he's going to go to the west. So it could be that in the end, wherever the sun places it is more than 2,000 amot to the east, or more than 2,000 amot to the west of where the guy is standing, in which case he can't reach it. And he's within 2,000 amot of his house, so that eruv by default is invalid because it's too far for him to reach it. And by default, his house, which is within his reach, is where his eruv is going to be. Now, if he were not within 2,000 amot of his house or the eruv, then you're going to have two problems, because you're going to have a double problem, because he's not within range of his house, and he didn't want to make his current position his eruv. So are we going to go by his current position, or are we going to say that now he has 2,000 amot from where he is, or are we going to say he's outside of his eruv and therefore he has only 4 amot in each area? So that's a whole other issue. Rava bar Rav Shela Amar afilu tema lemizrach lemizrach beto Rav beto kegon dekae bete be'alachsona. The other possibility is that no, actually we could be talking about where the guy is to the east or west of his house. So let's look at it here. In other words, in Rashi's diagram, you can see that the guy is over here. He tells him to put he is on a diagonal. Okay, let's say this is east. So he is to the east of his house and to the east of the eruv. The only thing is, from himself to the eruv is due east, and to his house is, let's say, northeast. Right? In other words, it's on a diagonal. So he could be closer to his house than he is to the eruv, or he could be closer to the eruv than he is to his house. Both of them are to the east of where he is actually standing. And yet, he can be closer to one than to the other, depending on where his son actually deposits it. So the point is that the case is possible. We can envision the case in more than one way as being real. Okay, that you can have a situation where the house, in other words, the point is that since the house is, now if both of them were within 2,000 amot of where he's standing, so obviously we would go with the eruv, because that was the one he wanted. The question is, when the eruv becomes invalid, then we go back to his default of his house, which is within 2,000 amot of where he's standing. Now, so we say that if you place the eruv within the outskirts of the city, it's invalid because it's not outside. You didn't add anything to what you could already walk. So what does it mean to put the eruv there? It's like putting eruv in your house. You can walk it doesn't change anything. And it says you put it outside the techum. Once you put it outside the city limit, so now let's say you put it 5 amot. Let's say you put it 1,000 amot outside the city limit. So now that's 1,000 amot less that you can go to the east, that you can go to the west. You can go now 3,000 amot to the west, but only 1,000 to the east. So the Gemara says, so did you mean that he actually placed the eruv outside the techum? That's not possible, because if he places it more than 2,000 amot outside the city, he can't even get to it on Shabbat. And it would be invalid anyway. What it means is outside of the outskirts. In other words, he has to put it outside the city, but he can't put it more than 2,000 amot outside the city, because if he does that, it won't be valid. So now the Gemara says, now it said that whatever he does, in other words, since he's moving his position to the west, if he gains 5 amot or 10 amot to the west, he loses the commensurate amount to the east, and vice versa. Is that really all he loses? Let's see if that's true. Because we learned in a Braita, if you put your eruv inside the outskirts of the city, then afilu ama. So he says afilu ama achat. So he says. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. So if it's within the outskirts, he hasn't done anything. Nitano. If he puts it outside the outskirts, afilu ama achat mistaker ota ama umafsid et kol ha'ir kula mipnei shemidat ha'ir ola lo b'midat ha'techum. That how does it work? Here's the issue. Let's say the person is living in a city, and he puts the eruv to the west of the city 1,000 amot. So he actually loses more than 1,000 amot. Why? Because when he was in the city, he could go a full 2,000 amot to the east of the city, and a full 2,000 amot to the west of the city. But if he puts his eruv 1,000 amot to the west of the city, now he can only, let's say the whole city, the width of the city was 5,000 amot. He could walk all the way from one end of the city to the other, 5,000 amot, plus another 2,000 to the east. Or he could walk all the way from the east side of the city to the west side, that's 5,000 amot, plus 2,000 amot to the west, which would be 7,000 amot. But once he puts an eruv, 1,000 amot to the west, he can walk to the edge of the city and 3,000 amot to the west now, because 1,000 amot to his Eruv and another 2,000. But now he can only walk from the western edge of the city 1,000 amot into the city. He can't walk the full 5,000 amot across the city anymore. So he actually loses way more than just 1,000 amot, because he loses the entire 4,000 amot of the city plus the 2,000 amot on the other side.
Is this the first time we heard this?
We mentioned it before, but in passing. But this is where they're developing it, okay? So you lose a lot more.
I always assumed the city was free.
Unless, well, we'll see. No, it's not necessarily. Only when you're in the city it's free. But not when you're outside. So it says, La kashya, no problem. Kan shekalta midato b'chatzi ha'ir, kan shekalta midato b'sof ha'ir. Ukud Rav Idi amar Rav Yoshua ben Levi, haya moded uva v'kalta midato b'chatzi ha'ir, en lo ela chatzi ha'ir. Kalta midato b'sof ha'ir, naset lo ha'ir kula, kedaled amot, mashlimin lo et ha'sha'ar. So what it means is like this, that if you're counting the Tichum, and you come to the middle of the city, you can only go to the middle of the city. However, here's the catch. Let's say the entire city was only 1,000 amot wide. So you put your Eruvei Tchumim to the west, 1,000 amot. So you can actually go to the east, the 1,000 amot, from your Eruvei Tchumim to the edge of the city, and the entire city can be traversed. Right? Because there's 1,000 amot. Now let's say, so he says, in that case, since the Tichum overlaps the entire city, it encompasses the entire city, now that city is only considered 4 amot, because it overlaps the entire thing. So what does that mean? That means that since your Eruv Tichumin is to the west of the city, it's 1,000 amot. You can walk from your Eruv Tichumin to the edge of the city, that's only 1,000 amot. Then another 1,000 amot, you'll be on the east side of the city. But that 1,000 amot is only counted as 4, because the entire city is subsumed. Since your Tichum includes the city is considered like 4 amot. If your Tichum only reaches half the city, like the city is 2,000 amot itself, then you can only walk up to half the city. But if it actually covers the entire city, now that whole city is 1,000 amot, so how much have you really traversed halachically? Only 1,004 amot. So you still have 996 amot to the east that you can walk. So that's the distinction. When the Tichum ends in the middle of the city, we actually quantify the city. When the Tichum encompasses the entire city, now the city is reduced to 4 amot. The whole thing is considered 4 amot. Okay? So now, Amar Rav Idi. Rav Idi himself said, and Rabbi Idi is the one who was reporting this, and he says, Ein elu ela divrei neviut. This is just a matter of prophecy. What does that mean? In other words, Rashi explains, what does neviut mean? This is like somebody prophesying, who doesn't give any reason behind his words. In other words, what he means is, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, who told us this, must have received this as a tradition. He couldn't have invented this, because it doesn't make any sense. Because Mali kalata b'chatzi ha'ir, Mali kalata b'sof ha'ir. What difference should it make whether the Tichum reaches the other end of the city, or whether it reaches the middle of the city? If we're anyway going to reduce the city to being considered 4 amot, why should the Tichum have to reach the other side of the city to do that? Like you're saying, it should be, once it touches the city and overlaps it all, it should be reduced to 4 amot automatically. So Amar Rava. So Rava says, Tarvayu Tanane, we have both of these ideas. He says, no, we have both of these cases in a Braita. Okay, it's not a matter of niviut. It's not a matter of prophecy. Why? Because Anshei Ir Gdola Mehalechin et Kol Ir Ktana. It says that people from the large city who place their Eruv in the next city, okay, or their Eruv overlaps with the next city, so they can walk the entire length of the small city. But the people in the small city cannot walk the whole length of the big city. So my time, what's the reason? It must be, Rava says, that the people living in the small city, their Eruv doesn't reach the entirety of the large city. It only makes it halfway, so that's why they can only walk halfway. Whereas the people in the large city, their Tichum can overlap the entire small city, because the small city is smaller in width, and therefore it overlaps, and that's why they can walk the entirety of the small city, because it's subsumed under their eruv. Okay? The Rabbi Idi will answer you, no, I don't believe that's what those Braitot are talking about. In other words, you're right he's trying to prove. In other words, Rabbi Idi is wedded to the idea that this concept, that it matters whether the Tchum completely overlaps with the city or only partially overlaps, is a tradition. There's no explanation, there's no basis for it. And what you're talking about here is something else. That Anshe Taneh Umokim la benoten Aval moded lo. Okay, aval moded lo tanan. So what he says is that Rabbi Idi will say, no, that what we're talking about here is not a matter of not what you're saying, where one city's Tchum overlaps the other city and one city's Tchum doesn't overlap the other city. Rashi explains here. He says, Umukela, what does he say here? That it means, Benoten Eruvo Be'ir. When you place the Eruv in a city, Kedmafish Bematnitin, Ketzad Mishaya Be'ir Gdola Benatan Eruvo Be'ir Ktana, Smuchala Betoch Alpaim Mahalachit Kula, She'eruv Konelo Kola'ir. That it means not that the people in the large city put an Eruv Tchumin and the Eruv that they got overlapped the small city. That's not what it's talking about. What it means is that they actually put their Eruvei Tchumin in the small city. Okay? Okay, so, and they're Kedalat Amot Kilu Shabbat Sham. So, in other words, he says that first of all, you're making a mistake. You're making a mistake because your text distinguishes between the small and the small city and the large city. The correct text of the Braita is that in both cases it's good. It doesn't say, it says anshe. In other words, in both cases they're allowed to. And what case are we talking about? We're talking about a case where you actually place your eruv. Let's say there were two cities that were only 1,000 amot apart. So the people in city A put their eruv in city B. The people in city B put their eruv in city A. So each city becomes like 4 amot to the people who place their eruv in there. Because that is now considered the place where everybody in city A is now considered theoretically, halachically, to be living in city B. And vice versa. That's why we say that. But if you're counting a techum from, in other words, you place your eruv tchumin in the forest, and you're walking 2,000 amot from the forest and you reach another city, it depends. If your tchum extends and encompasses the entire city, then the entire city is 4 amot. If it only makes it halfway through the city, you can only walk halfway through the city. Just like I said. That's what he says. So what he says is that basically what we're talking about here is but in our situation where you're measuring the tchum, he says there's no logical explanation for why it should be that if the tchum ends halfway through the city, you don't get the whole city. But if it ends at the end of the city, then the whole city becomes 4 amot. He says that's a tradition that we have. There's no explaining it, and that's why we can only know it by tradition. But if you actually placed your eruv in the adjoining city, the fact that adjoining city becomes 4 amot for you, that we understand. Because any place that you establish your eruv in, just like in your own city, where you live, is like 4 amot. We don't start counting the tchum until you exit the city. So too, for the city that you placed your eruv inside.